Hey everyone, my name is Nick Brandt. I am the product designer on the plan team within Product Planning Group. Today I wanted to go over some of the work item planning views effort that's in progress and give a bit of an update since my last showcase, which I essentially went over our current effort around essentially a bunch of large features that all tied together for planning views. And I had put together an initial vision for some of that work just because I wanted to look at it more holistically. And then now we're starting to kind of break down some of that work into implementation. Um, I'll probably go through some of this beginning part a little bit fast because it's going to be similar to some of the stuff I presented earlier. And then I'll kind of slow down once I get to some of the more newer work. So the first thing I wanted to show is, so essentially like the first piece that we had broken off of that work was the consolidated list. And what that was combining what we have today as the issues list and the epics list into one work items listing page. So that's actually something you can see now today with our internal team on the work items page within Plan. So now you have things like epics and issues living together, where I can then filter upon just seeing like a specific type if I wanted to. Um, but this kind of starts the process of like consolidating all of our work items to one view. The next bigger piece that was coming after that, which we've actually tied together for this initial release for MVC, is save views. And so I went over a bit of that last time. A lot of it has changed a bit since getting some, both internal feedback as well as we did some solution validation addition. So I wanted to review kind of where we're at with save views, which is currently in implementation. It's actually pretty close, and I was initially going to actually showcase this more like live in GDK, but it's not quite there to where I can do that. So I'll be using a prototype I had built previously to kind of showcase where we're at with that. So save views. So the biggest thing that you'll notice when coming to this work items page is now we have these tabs at the top with the default tab of all items. Additionally, you have this add view area or add view button where I can add a new view, I can browse views, and I'll kind of show you what some of that looks like. So browsing views, this is essentially a way to look at any view that's been created within my namespace with this Gruber project. So say my team has created like a daily stand-up that we utilize. This is where anyone could essentially add this to their views. And now they get this view set up where it's kind of based off of this shared view that we've all created. Um, and I can kind of view it however I want here. Um, Additionally, let's say I add another view. Let's say like backlog is another one that we utilize, which is also set up a bit differently in a list view, grouped by things like milestone. So this is nice in the fact where I can go to this work items page and I can kind of flip through different, say, views that I care about. It's essentially like pre-filtered, pre-configured views based off of either my needs or a team's needs. So these could be personal views that only I care about, or they could be views that are, like I said, like shared between our team that we all utilize. And these view tabs at the top are very much specific to me as a user. So I can like reorder these however I want in order for me to like work best with my setup, as well as I can add or remove whatever views I want without affecting anyone else's kind of view list here at the top. Sorry, just one second. With each view, we also have a set of options that you can do. So there's a drop down here where I can do things like edit the view, where I could do things such as like change the title of what this is called, update a description if we included one. Visibility is more than a read-only in this aspect because someone else actually created the view. If I was the owner, I would be able to actually change this to be, right now you have two choices, either shared or private. So I could change that back to being just private to myself if I wanted to, if I was the creator. So that's essentially what we offer within the edit area. Additionally, you could do things like duplicate the view. You could copy a link to share it with some of your other team members. And then we have two options here which are quite different from one another. One is remove from list, and then the other is delete view. So like the main difference between these two items are remove from list is essentially, specific to me. So like if I were to remove this from list, I no longer see it here, but it still exists as a view that I could add. So I could go back in here and backlog is still there. I can add it back. If I were to actually delete the view, this we put confirmation modals because it's more destructive action. This would actually delete the view. Both like I wouldn't see it and anyone who had access to it would also lose it. So if I were to go through and actually delete this view, it's no longer going to actually show here within my views options that are within the namespace or project. So that's essentially how like browsing and adding existing views work. But let's look at an instance of like actually creating a saved view. So let's say I'm on my all items tab and I start to do some filtering. Say I care about, label that we've been using for some items based off of like launch. I go ahead and search. So that label is now applied. We are now presented with an option to save. Um, let's say I want to do some additional configuration first. So let's say I want to, group this information by milestone. And then now this is kind of where I want it for my team. And let's go ahead and say save this view. So you're presented with those similar options that I had presented for like the edit view, where you get a title description area, as well as I can set this to either private for myself or shared between the entire namespace. We're defaulting to private just because one of the issues we've had on boards is that there's an abundance of different boards within the list, and sometimes those are just specific to just one person or maybe even a couple people. But we want to promote using private when it's makes sense and only like introduce it as shared or like expand it to everyone in those cases where it's needed. So that's why we're having default as private. But let's go ahead and let's say this one, we do want to make it shared. It's regarding the product launch, and I go ahead and create this view. So it's now added as the last item here in my list. Um, but let's say, I decided that I want to actually make a few changes to this view. Let's say I wanted to actually see it in like a board layout. After making changes, you're presented with a couple different options here. One is reset to defaults, the other is save changes. So if I wanted to look at it like this and keep it like this for the inevitable future, but not impact anyone else, I could essentially like ignore these and continue to view it like this. And anytime I come back to this view, it's going to look like I had seen it in the last state. If I ever wanted to go back to the defaults that were set for the view, I could easily do that by hitting reset to defaults. Or on the other hand, if I wanted to actually make this how everyone sees it that actually has added the view, I could then instead save the changes, which we again do a confirmation modal to kind of explain like this isn't just saving it for yourself, but it's anyone who has the view. So if I save changes, those actions are then removed because this is now the default state of the view. And that's essentially where you can kind of go from there. So those are like the main pieces of the save views aspect, which is currently being built. There are some things in this prototype that aren't in the first MVC, such as like this whole notion of group by is not going to be there. We do already have visibility fields, which is included. But the other main thing that's not included is the ability to toggle between different view modes, board and list. Currently, it's going to be just the list layout for the first MVC. But that lets me get into the next piece that I wanted to go over, which is the new boards experience. So today we have boards that are living with this separate section today of the product, either issue boards or epic boards. Um, so if you wanted to ever, view a board, you have to go to the separate section and potentially put in the same filters that you've done before. It's just a bit disconjointed from like these other planning views that we have, and our goal is to bring these all together. Additionally, like when you look at the board section, like we have this, switcher between board views. We have a filter bar like you're used to in other areas, but then we also have this configured board area where you can essentially set these different filters. like predefined for the board, as well as some additional options. And it gets to be a bit confusing because then you have like two areas where you're managing what you're seeing on the board. And so like that's one problem we're trying to move away from. We also have very few display options right now for the board view, which we're looking to expand upon, as well as like the whole way that board lists work today is a bit of a manual process. So, let's say you wanted to create a status board for your team. Today, you would essentially have to go through and create a new list for each status, rather than essentially an option to have like preset lists based off of the statuses that you have defined for your namespace. So these are some of the things that we're looking to solve, in addition to pulling this into this like work items page experience and having it more as like a view mode rather than a separate section of the product. So that is what I've been doing a lot of design around recently. And so, some of that is some, visual updates to our boards list. Somewhat minor, but there's some also like some consistency things that we're trying to address, such as like today, when you look at a board card, some of the stuff is arranged quite differently than how we have it in like the list page or like the child items area, where there's not really a good reason for why we do this, such as like the type is shown a bit differently, like where we show the ID, we have labels like more prominent here, and just like some small things like that where, we're fine making like intentional decisions to have the board layout a bit different, but we want to make these different views and how we show items consistent where it makes sense. And so this aligns more towards that. Like one of those things like, moving the type up. Previously type wasn't really that important on a board because most of the time previously you were only seeing one type, whereas in the future you are going to have multiple types visible on a board where we're going to have epochs and issues combined as well as additional types. Um, some other larger changes here, you'll notice that we no longer have like a configure board area. So like that's all going to be managed with these new views, where you're going to have one area, the filter bar, which is going to be like your source of truth of what's saved to the view. So that kind of gets away from this like dueling experience of like two areas to manage filters. And then the last bigger thing is how we're actually managing these lists. So, like I mentioned before, it was more of like a manual process of setting up these lists for boards. Where in the future we're moving towards more automated, like preset grouping mechanisms to set up these boards. So I've gone through and I've, designed out a bunch of different states and flows for all of this. Um, things like hover and different actions and active states for cards, as well as, like potentially updating like the drag state to make that a bit right now there's kind of some issues where like dragging cards like where we actually try to place the card within the new area. It kind of makes a shift that's undesirable in cases. So like potentially updating this to just like show an indicator where you're moving items. And I've kind of gone through and done like a whole like kind of array of different flows and designs for this. And the next step that I typically like to do when I start to get a bit more finalized in terms of design is to put things into a prototype like I showed you for saved views. Um, this time I decided to try something a bit different now that we have access to Figma Make. And so I was like, okay, let me put together a really good prompt for what we're trying to do. Let me attach like the main design file that essentially showcases this new boards experience, and let's see what Figma Make gives me. And this was the first iteration that I got. So not ideal, not the best first impression, but it was essentially a few errors that it had run into where after it fixed those, it got me to a pretty decent starting place of I at least had some like lists. It definitely wasn't aligned to the design as much as I had hoped, but I was able to continue to like iterate on that and prompt it to get to a good place where eventually I had a pretty good working version of what I was trying to demonstrate. So this is what I have now in terms of this new boards experience. You can do things like showcase this new drag and drop functionality. I can showcase some of this display options that I was just starting to get into. Things like, right now today we only have a manual sort by essentially on boards. But in the future, we're going to offer other options such as like created date, which does introduce other things such as like, well, now when I'm dragging, I can't really specify exactly where I'm dragging this because it's already sorted. So how do we show that? And it's doing things like, showing some sort of indication like drop it here to move this list, but it's actually sorted by created date right now. So it's going to be automatically sorted. Um, Group by, subgroup by, I'll get into this in a bit because it's a little bit more complex. Show empty groups. So let's say, like for example, on this list, the done column doesn't show anything. That's because like anything that's done is actually closed. And right now I have this set to only show me open items. So let's say I don't actually care about seeing empty groups. I can easily toggle that off. And then, that makes it a little bit more clean here from my experience. Additionally, we already have like these field options for things like the list view, and we're going to be adding these to the board view as well. So like I could turn off various different fields that I don't care about seeing or see just the ones that I care about. Additionally, we have custom fields now available. So it's going to start kind of blowing up what options users will have in terms of showing additional things. And so like this kind of provides an expandable area to where I could, have quite a few different custom fields that could potentially be shown, but it supports that pretty well. Um, the other big thing in here is group by. I know I'm getting pretty close to time here, but I'll try and go through this pretty quickly. So group by is essentially this new mechanism for how we're setting up these lists. So right now, the setting is set to group by status. So if I click in here, I can see, group by, we're set to status. It's set to sort ascending based off of how I've set these statuses up in the product. I could change the ordering to descending, or I could say I want to just do these manual. I could then, move these around based off of whatever I want. Um, Alternately, I could say like, I only care about seeing things that are to do and in progress at this time and only see those options. Um, so this gives you a way to kind of configure the board based off of these like set attributes or like grouping mechanisms, which then you could change different settings here. So like right now I only include like label and assign as other options, but we're going to be, showing different things such as like milestone and other valuable grouping mechanisms. But this starts to see how like you could essentially kind of set this up based off of what's needed for your board. It gets to be a little bit problematic for instances where like if you group by label, for instance, if you did this in GitLab org, we have like hundreds of labels. So what do you do there? And we have some essentially like some limit set up where we're only going to allow like 40 lists on a board. And so essentially you would get like an error message indicating like you have to select, can only select up to, 40 list items, and then you would essentially be able to choose which list you want to set up, which I have some designs for, but I just haven't integrated that into this prototype. But all in all, like setting this up, it was pretty cool to be able to use Figma Make for this. I was able to put together the majority of this within one Friday, which was pretty cool. I will say, like, there was a lot of back and forth prompting with Figma Make in terms of like, no, this doesn't actually align to the design. Like, I was making sure to, utilize, you can actually tie to um, a file within Figma as like your component library, which I've done. But right now you can only tie to one file, which is a bit problematic. I would like to tie to like multiple things, such as like our SVG library and other things. Um, but there are some mechanisms that you can use within Figma Make to make things a bit better, such as this guidelines file. This is something where you can actually give some guidelines to Figma Make in terms of like what they should do for certain things. Like some of the things that I found out which would be helpful, I didn't realize at first, was like I can actually tell them some packages to install to utilize within the implementation. So they could actually use GitLab's component library and SVG library. I could also like tell it, always try and do like create tests when possible, or use design tokens whenever available, things like this. And this is where I think it would be really great if we can set up some sort of like boilerplate guidelines file that people could use, which helps to kind of set the stage when creating something like Figma Make. So I think I'll potentially work on creating an issue within like Pajama's project around trying to come up with, maybe a default template we could have for users just to add here to make setting up this a bit better and potentially having a better initial experience than something like that. But yeah, I know I'm at time here, so I'll go ahead and end there.
Awesome. Thanks, Nick, for sharing. There are a couple questions in the agenda, but we don't have time to vocalize them. So if you could take a look at async, thanks so much for presenting.
Will do. Thank you.